Hello, good evening everyone. My name is Liz Foster. I'm a member of the Seattle branch here of the ISO, and thanks so much for coming to tonight's meeting on the coal trains and their effect and resistance to them. We've got two fantastic speakers tonight. Our first, Robin Everett, is an organizer at the Sierra Club. She is the lead organizer around the coal train, resistance to the coal trains, and she's going to talk to us a bit about what exactly this project is and why folks are opposed to it and what we can do to help support and build that. And then our second speaker, Chris Mobley, is a member of the International Socialist Organization here in Seattle. He's a longtime activist, has done work around public transportation, work for environmental justice, and he's going to talk to us, put this project in a broader perspective, or a broader context, I should say. So without further ado, we're going to turn it over to Robin. Can you hit the light on your way out, Johnny? Thank you.
So this is a map of what is proposed at this point. Actually, this is an old map. One of the terminals has been defeated since this map was created. Yeah, so basically the idea is coal is going to be mined, or is currently being mined, in Montana and Wyoming. It holds about 40% of our coal that we use for production here in America. Mainly, it's all energy production. And so currently, if you were to see a bigger map, a lot of the coal goes east and south. And the coal plants east and south are starting to shut down. And so in response to that, Big Coal is looking for a new market to sell its dirty product. And it sees China and India as that new market. But in order to get there, they got to come through us. And so there are currently 5 proposals for coal exports. There's the one that most directly affects us is up in Bellingham near Cherry Point, but there's also others proposed. The one in Grays Harbor there, that big star, that is the one that has been defeated since this began. And if you had told me, 2 years ago that Grays Harbor would be the first one to go down, I would have said no way, but it's really great. So, Cherry Point, Washington, for our purposes today, the coal export terminal proposed here would have the most direct effect on Seattle, being that the coal trains would have to come through Seattle to get here. The other ones on the proposal wouldn't actually have to go through Seattle, although they would go through many other communities. So there's still plenty of people to be affected. This is what Cherry Point looks like right now. It is a really beautiful land. There is a BP refinery up there, so that kind of spoils some of it, but this is a marine protected area. This is Lummi Native American burial grounds. This is a very, very beautiful spot, home to the Cherry Point herring, which is a very important species in the food chain, in the marine food chain. Important food for whales and salmon, and home to numerous wetlands. And that's what they want to turn it into. So this is the Tawasin port up at Point Roberts. This is half the size of what is proposed at Cherry Point. It's a big mess. So Cherry Point, 48 million tons. This is 24 million tons. And so there are a number of reasons why we're concerned about these projects. For one, it really threatens our quality of life and safety along the rail lines. Looking at, that's a picture of a coal train going through downtown Seattle, down by the waterfront. That's a coal train coming out, I think, out of Montana, so you can see the dust that comes off of them. And we're looking at, with this project, 18-mile-and-a-half long coal trains coming through Seattle every day. So that totals up to be over 6,500 per year. That's an enormous increase. And these are the longest, heaviest, dirtiest trains that exist. So this, we're not against trains. We're against trains that are carrying fossil fuels, for one. And these are the dirtiest trains that run on the rails. Additionally, these trains tend to tip over because they are so heavy, because they are so big, and because actually the coal dust coming off of them interferes with the track structure. They tend to derail more than any other train. Last year alone in the summer, another key point on this is heat. When it's hot, it really starts to happen. So the tracks start to work, and these are the big heavy trains that they fall over. So this summer, there was something like 18 coal train derailments across the country. 2 people died in Chicago. 2 teenagers died in South Dakota, and this is just people crossing, on the street. Just we happen to be nearby. This one was in Mesa, Washington this summer, which is out in eastern Washington. And you can see kind of what this can look like when they fall off the tracks, and we're talking destroyed. It's not like you just put this train back up, it's destroyed. And so luckily this was in a very unpopulated area, but you can imagine if this happened in Soto or in, along the Puget Sound in Edmonds, something like that. It could be really destructive. Coal export also threatens our health. The diesel particulate matter coming out of the trains, we're looking at 4 to 5 diesel engines per train. So it's a lot more than a lot of trains have. A lot of trains just have 2 diesel engines in the front and you're pulling. But these guys need pushers in the back, so you're getting diesel at both ends. And then also the coal dust coming off of the trains. These are 2 health issues for respiratory illnesses mainly. But there is also concerns about emergency vehicles being able to cross. These trains take like 10 minutes to go by. So you can imagine every minute that somebody's in an ambulance or waiting for a fire truck is really important. And in fact, it's not just the Sierra Club that's saying this, but the Washington Academy of Family Physicians, Washington and Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, 160 doctors up in Bellingham called the Walking Docs, and the Washington Naturopathic Society all agree that this is a really bad proposal for our health, and that a health impact assessment should be done during the course of reviewing this project. And coal exports also threatens our marine economy and wildlife. This is a typical coal ship that would be pulling up into just north of Bellingham. For reference, that is a ferry, one of the bigger ferries down below. That's to scale. You get kind of a sense of the size of these ships. They're the biggest ships that run on the planet, full of coal. And so we're looking at roughly around 400 per year for Cherry Point. This is combined with any tar sands that are going to come through Canada and out through here. And you can imagine what could happen if one of them collide with each other. The Strait of Juan de Fuca and the area that this is the most congested shipping area in the world. One of the most, at least. And there's real potential for disaster up there. This is pristine water areas. This could be a BP up there. In addition, there's a lot of fishermen and farmers and others that are coming out against this project because of the threats that this project has to their existing jobs here. I have a lot of fishermen who are concerned about ocean acidification and what climate change is doing to their profession. And this, like one of my fishermen says, he owns Loki Fish and sells at all the farmers markets around here. He says, we don't know what could be the final nail in the coffin to the fishing industry, but this could very well be it. There are so many impacts that they are dealing with right now when it comes to climate change and ocean acidification that any additional burden upon them could be the tipping point. I have fishermen in Mount Vernon who say that right now, this year when they were in Alaska, they couldn't even use the tide books as a reference because it wasn't forecasting anything like what's happening now. So it's scary. It's really scary. And the idea of shipping, you know, this is 50 million tons, but combined, all these proposals, it's about 150 million tons of coal. It's a big proposition for the effects on our waterways and ocean acidification and our fishing. Additionally, I would say this, a lot of main town businesses are very concerned, or Main Street businesses are concerned about this as well, because the train tracks often run right through the middle of town, and so a number of small community businesses are concerned about what does that mean for people being able to get across the tracks and get to my business. And so we have over 500 small businesses signed on opposed to this, from Bellingham to Mount Vernon, and Spokane and beyond. Oh, Jesus, okay. Can I have 8 minutes?
Yeah, we'll see what
Okay. All right. So Big Daddy for me, and a lot of other people, is the threat that this has on our climate, and I touched a little bit upon it. Why don't you guys get a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about carbon and 150 million tons of coal? Every single person in all those red states would have to get out of the car to counterbalance the carbon that would come from these projects. So this is huge. This is bigger than Keystone. This is a huge, huge threat to our climate. Not only is it a ton of carbon, but it also is opening up a door for a new life for coal. Right now in America, we are ending the coal industry here. And this is their second chance. This is their final, kicking, dying wish, is to get this out of America and into foreign markets. And if Washington lets it happen, you're giving a new breath of life into a really, really dirty and dangerous industry. And so this year, we kicked ass, I have to say. We had the first public comment period happening around this particular proposal, Cherry Point. And we had hearings across Washington State, in Bellingham and the San Juan Islands and Mount Vernon, Seattle, Vancouver, and Spokane. This was the Mount Vernon hearing. 1,000 people turned out. Our color was red, their color was green. It's very interesting. And nobody even planned it, but then it turned out to be like we were the stop and they were the go, and it was very interesting. But you can see the few green. In Spokane, folks from Montana came out, which was really exciting. This is one of the best things about this project, is that it isn't just your typical environmentalists versus the job creators. This is ranchers, this is Native Americans, these are small business owners, elected officials, and yes, Escarinis as well. In Seattle, this was the big daddy of all the events. 2,500 people came out. You can't see it as well, but you can see it's a crap load of red. And it was really, really great. That press conference, the one at the top middle, again, it's hard to see, but it's full of Native Americans and ranchers who are very, very concerned about what and the increased mining associated with these projects would mean for their lands. We had doctors, solar manufacturers, Dow Constantine, the King County executive, and there's also a picture below of Mayor McGinn testifying. And then our friends at Backbone and Move On did this great light up thing on the overpasses on 45th and 50th to let people know about the hearing, and I thought that was really cool. And this is just the beginning, though. I mean, those hearings and that public comment period is the very, very, very beginning of the environmental review process for just one proposal, and it's the first proposal really getting reviewed. So we have a long way to go, and a lot of chances to stop these proposals. So right now, for this year, regulators are going to take all of our comments that we sent in, and they're going to review them, and they're going to go back and draft an environmental impact assessment or statement based on our comments. It's probably going to take them a year. So we have a little bit of downtime on Cherry Point right now. The Longview terminal down by Vancouver, Washington is about to start up its environmental review process. That's for 44 million tons going out. And so we will want to participate in that comment period coming up. They say spring, early summer, but I have learned to always push that back 4 to 6 months, so probably fall. But then Oregon is looking at permitting 2 at the Port of Morrow. And so we're fighting that. And then again in 2014, the draft EIS will come out on Cherry Point, and we'll have an opportunity again to comment and go to hearings and do all that. In the meantime, we will continue challenging every single mining permit that comes up. So Otter Creek is one of the most interesting ones because that is specifically for coal exports here in Northwest Washington, and it is on Northern Cheyenne land. And this is land that they took their land and they moved them here, and now they want to take it. It's really terrible. And so for this year, we will be looking at, like I said, the Longview scoping hearings, continuing the education of our elected leaders. We have a lot of new ones this year, particularly our governor, to really sit down and make sure and hold his feet to the fire. We have what we're looking for is an area-wide impact study. We're asking out of the Army Corps. We've been asking it for a year. They have yet to tell us yes or no, but this would study all of the proposals together and what those cumulative impacts would look like to Washington State. Because only when you look at it in that broad sense do you really get the true magnitude of what turning the Northwest into one of the world's largest coal exporting regions of the world really means. And then constituency building, I think, is an important piece for this year. The last 2 years we've been running really, guns to the ground to get everybody aware of this issue. We've got a lot of environmental groups on our side. We did pretty good on getting a bunch of elected leaders on our side. What we haven't done as good at, and what we'd like to do more of, is reaching out to some of those unusual constituencies. And I think Chris will talk a little bit about trying to bridge that gap between us and labor on this issue. We as Sierra Club work really well with labor, especially here in King County, but throughout Washington. And this is an issue that does divide us. And so we want to continue to look for ways to be together on at least maybe the solution side of some of this. And so that could look like waterfront redevelopment projects and other things like that to help us be able to go to Governor Inslee and say, look, we're not fighting all the time. These are the positive things that you can do together. But it also means, communities of color. It also means the farming industry. We could do a lot better with getting out into the agricultural sector. So there will be a number of constituencies that I'll be looking at to be talking to more of, and would love to hear from you guys if you have places that you think that that I should be bringing this presentation to or talking to people about. Really, it's going to be a lot. It's going to be that second layer of educating the public, I think, that we didn't really get to do in the last year and a half. And that's it.
Yeah, I wanted to cover a lot of different stuff, but hopefully bear with me. But first off, I really wanted to thank Robin for being here tonight. Also of the work specifically that Robin and the other organizers in the Sierra Club have done in really expanding, I think, this issue of a broad mainstream audience. Because, for somebody who's paid attention to these issues a lot, climate change is for such a long time has felt this daunting, overwhelming problem. It's a worldwide crisis that only has worldwide solutions, and so it's like, how can individual activists in every locale involve themselves in some kind of campaign or action to have an impact on climate change? And I think that this coal fight around the coal terminals really is part of that, in addition to the work going on around stopping the Keystone XL pipeline, amongst many other important fights around the country and also around the globe. So I think that this work here in the Northwest is going to be really critical, and it's really good to finally sink our teeth into something that we can actually have a concrete impact on. I mean, Robin and I did a really good job of going over really the specifics of just how awful this proposal is. I just want to add a couple other points, because I mean, you really can't, the more you dig into the proposal around Cherry Point and also all the different ports, the more you just find how really nasty it is. Not only the companies involved, but also the specific proposal. So just to start off, the company that is in charge of actually building the terminal, SSA Marine in Zurich. SSA Marine is one of the largest marine shipping companies or kind of logistics companies on the West Coast. They actually started some of the preliminary engineering work and actually construction work at Cherry Point without obtaining the proper permits. It's really important to note that Cherry Point is actually an aquatic, like kind of it's a wildlife refuge, just across the water from a wildlife refuge, where there is endangered species like blue heron, numerous different marine wildlife species. In addition to that, the Cherry Point itself is actually claimed by the Lumi Nation, a First Nations tribe here in Western Washington. Is actually a cemetery site for their buried dead. In addition to just all the other kind of, I think, health impacts. I mean, you go from all the stuff you covered, from the toxic dust, the risk of derailment. There was a really good article in Stranger this week that went into the fact that sometimes actually these coal trains can actually spontaneously combust into so much of the ash catching some kind of catching fire from that. So that's really just really nasty. One thing I really wanted to go into also just the way that the group that is that's backing the kind of political arm of the folks backing the coal terminals is called the Alliance for Northwest Jobs and Export, which is always great how these corporate entities kind of develop these Orwellian names to really kind of greenwash or make them sound so much better in the press. They spent so far about $1 million in TV ads in the Northwest. I don't know if you mentioned this, but in some of the hearings, some of the folks wearing actually green shirts turned out to actually be day laborers they hired from local Home Depots, Lowe's, people who were poor, who were desperate for jobs. And when they said, here, wear this shirt and show up to this hearing just to stand in line, not really knowing what they're doing, and they show up to some of the different hearings. And so, because I think they know there's actually not mass support for the coal terminals they want to build. In addition to that, and really specifically on bridging, I think, that labor and green kind of divide that exists right now, most of the local building trades unions actually do support the proposal because it's going to create around 2,600 jobs immediately for just construction purposes and around 200 permanent port jobs. And obviously in an economy like we have today, working people are desperate for any kind of job they can get that has can provide a living wage, such as these jobs will. But it is really kind of important to highlight who is labor getting in bed with. So one of the companies behind that's funding the coal export terminal, and is going to be the main beneficiary of it, is Peabody Energy, which was in basically right now is in a massive court battle on the East Coast with United Mine Workers over basically setting up them and Amber Energy, which is one of the other companies behind the port in Longview. They set up a subsidiary company called Patriot Energy, where they just dumped all of their employee benefit packages, all of the kind of obligations they had made over the years to union mine workers in the Appalachias, on the East Coast, to also all the different kind of liabilities they have for all the massive amounts of environmental damage that was done to the region, all the different kind of payments they need to make to fix that problem. They dumped all of those legal obligations into this kind of front company, spun it off as a subsidiary, and then let it fail on its own. So now it can't meet those obligations. The United Mine Workers are now in court trying to bring down this company. In addition to that, Peabody learned the lesson of how they don't really like the union workers in the East Coast, and so the area of in Wyoming and Montana that's actually being mined for coal is actually about 90% non-union. So it's not as if this company is somehow, they're trying to say we're going to create all these jobs and all that, this kind of great we're building a new economy on the basis of coal. It's really just a lot of bullshit, frankly, to put it bluntly. And I think that what some of the things I think we can do on the left and in the kind of environmental movement, I think to kind of bridge that divide is actually really try to work on some of the solutions, I think. So for example, there is no shortage of infrastructure projects that could be built that actually have a benefit to transforming our transportation, our CO2 emissions here in Washington, and particularly in the Seattle area, that actually will employ the exact same types of workers involved in the Cherry Point terminal. So for example, I mean, most of our greenhouse gas emissions that get put out in the Seattle area are from transportation, from people driving cars. Most of our energy comes from hydroelectric dams, which have environmental problems, but CO2 emissions are not one of them. And so actually trying to move away from a car-based kind of transportation system and moving towards more light rail, more streetcars, getting people more on bikes, all the kind of infrastructure that we could be doing, really I think is something that we should latch onto. So there's some really concrete proposals. There was a really kind of awful proposal from the outgoing Governor Gregoire, around kind of a new statewide transportation package that was very heavy on highway construction. And I think there's definitely, we can pressure Governor Inslee, I think, to say, you know what, we don't want more highways, we actually want more green infrastructure. There's the talk of it, the accelerating the next round of Sound Transit like rail expansion plans. Right now, the Sound Transit Board has been talking about accelerating the vote to bring the plan actually of expanding light rail to Ballard and West Seattle and to other areas in the east side by 2016. And so actually kind of working with labor on how we can accelerate that, how can we get taxmen for that and actually start to create those green jobs. And some of the concrete proposals I think we can kind of work on. And that's one of the things that I know some of the folks in ISO are actually going to try to work on, is actually having an open letter to different labor leaders and actually getting the other labor activists we know are on our side on this issue to kind of work with their brothers and sisters in the labor movement. So that's a lot. All I'm going to say specifically about Cherry Point and the coal terminals, and I want to kind of put this also, I think, in a broader context. So the last round of international climate negotiations held in Doha, Qatar, they were officially known as the Conference of 18. What did the 18 stand for? It was a number of years that they've been negotiating to come up with a treaty that preceded it that was supposedly legally binding, which was the Kyoto Protocol, negotiated in the late 90s. Kyoto expired late last year, so far there's been nothing new. Kyoto is supposedly meant to reduce carbon dioxide emissions on average for the developed countries by 8%, and carbon emissions since the implementation of Kyoto in 1987 have gone up by 50%. So basically it's a worthless scrap of paper, and the international community has been negotiating no real change. It is pretty clear that we are seeing the limits of which the planet can absorb the punishment that it is taking without changing into another climactic state. One we have not experienced in human civilization. Because the last 12,000 years of a relatively benign, stable climate happened to coincide with the rise of human civilization, that of us living in settled communities. Key to this was and still is agriculture. And if you cannot predict what is going on with the climate, when it's going to rain, where it's going to rain, how much it's going to rain, agriculture becomes pretty hard to actually maintain, and puts the whole question of human survival in sharp focus. So we are facing an absolutely critical point in terms of where we are right now, because there are two systems that are in fundamental conflict with each other. One is the capitalist system, and the other is the climate system. And there is no indication that capitalism is about to change. In fact, quite the opposite. A recent report shows that the world consumes about 85 million barrels of oil every single day, which is really crazy to think about, that basically every single day there has to be 85 million barrels that have to be extracted from the ground, burnt off for just the basic functioning of the economy. That is set to rise, though, by 2020 to 110 million barrels. So basically, where we need to be going in terms of what scientists say in terms of the different kind of CO2 emissions reductions, the international economy, international leaders, corporate leaders, political leaders are all moving in the opposite direction. Citibank issued a report saying that, the United States would become the new Middle East, that it would rival Saudi Arabia by 2020 in its output of fossil fuels. In the meantime, of course, natural gas has come down in price, which has started to displace coal. As a result, greenhouse gas emissions have decreased in the US, but not because we're using less fossil fuels, but because we're using less coal specifically. But has the world as a whole used less coal, which is really, greenhouse gas emissions don't abide by international or by national boundaries. No, not at all. Because what we are doing with coal, what they are doing with coal they can't sell in the U.S., they are selling to China. And China is building coal plants built on U.S. fuel, which allows the U.S. political class to turn around and blame China for not stopping its emissions. And therefore, why should we, despite it's all based on U.S. exports, why should we have to reduce our emissions? Which is really the argument being put out by the U.S. kind of political establishments. Amongst all of this, amongst all of this, we have the World Bank issuing a report that now the world is on track for 4 Celsius degree rise in global temperatures over the next 50 years. Now, any climate scientist will tell you that the maximum that we can possibly endure and be in a world that resembles anything that any of us grew up in is about 2 degrees Celsius. So the World Bank is now saying that we're on track for a 4 degree rise. This is quoting the report. And there is no certainty that an adaptation to a 4 degree C world is possible. A 4 degree C world is one in which communities, cities, and countries would experience severe damage, disruptions, and dislocations, with many of these risks spread unequally. It is likely that the poor will suffer the most and the global community will become more fractured and unequal than today. The projected 4 degree C warming must not be allowed to occur. The heat must be turned down. Now, just to point out though, this is the exact same organization that up until 2011, 25% of its energy loans that it loaned out to countries around the world went to coal plants, of building coal-fired energy plants, and is currently funding 29 new coal plants around the world. So on the one hand, they're saying, look, this is terrible, this is about to happen, and on the other hand, they're stuffing money into new coal plant production. For Marxists, this is the way that we see capitalism operate in terms of the social exploitation of all of us who suffer, what is also mirrored by the exploitation of natural resources. Because as Marx said, you need both things, nature and labor, brought together in order for capitalism to operate. This voracious system is not built on producing things that we actually need, but producing things that make the most amount of money in the shortest amount of time. And anything else is a secondary consideration to which they almost pay no attention. This system is built on the premise of continual expansion. Therefore, when it is not expanding, as we can see today, if it's not expanding by about 2 to 3% per year, it's in crisis. And so there are cuts to social programs, layoffs, unemployment, all the things we see right now today. But we live on a finite planet, so there's a fundamental contradiction. How can you have continuous expansion of the economy as a basis for how the capitalist system works on a planet that has finite resources? And right now, we are at the limit of what the planet can absorb and maintain in its biospheric integrity, in the ways we understand it. So 4C warmer would be warmer than any time in the last 13 million years. 4 degrees colder, for comparison's sake, would be the Ice Age 20,000 years ago. So just to put that in context, 4 degrees C colder would be, where we're standing right now, would be under about 1.5 miles of ice right now. So that's the kind of, in terms of the other direction, that's the kind of direction the planet is currently moving in. So unimaginable things, and not things that are off in the far future, that our grandchildren will experience, but clearly we are getting a taste of them today. For example, this year, the US has experienced the worst drought in 50 years. This is to the point where parts of the Mississippi River, which accounts for about 1/3 of all trade in the United States, is no longer able to actually accommodate barge traffic because the water level is so low because of drought. In July, a portion of a Greenland ice sheet that melts usually in the summer melted in 4 days. We've had 2 hurricanes in New York in a 12-month period. The latest, Hurricane Sandy, had its strength increased and path directly affected by the warming of the Atlantic Ocean, which is confirmed by the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Yet there is no urgency about what we should be doing, which is mobilizing to change over the energy systems. In fact, quite the opposite. There's a doubling down on oil extraction in the Canadian Plains through the incredibly damaging oil shale extraction, the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline to move this oil for export, more offshore oil permits. I don't know if people saw it. Just recently there was a huge disaster with Shell trying to move a offshore oil platform into Alaska. And this is even after the BP oil spill in the Gulf, which I don't think I need to really tell anybody about how awful it has and how it's actually dramatically affected the inner workings of that region. And of course, I think the coal terminals would be another example of this. I think it's really interesting also to really look into why hasn't there been any kind of solution offered, right? I don't think it's so much a technological problem. Sometimes it's put forward as that we don't have the technology to remedy these problems. That's complete nonsense. I think this is entirely a social and a political question. It has nothing to do with technology, because we know solar energy works, we know wind farms work, we know distributed power, which would enable those types of energy systems to work practically, works. Energy conservation works, among many things, just in the energy sector alone, let alone even the transportation sector, which I touched on, which just to say, someone who's been involved in transportation planning, the thought that our entire transportation system is organized around each one of us individually owning this little box we drive around, which sits idle 95% of the time, and we have to find a lot of space to put it at, we have to transform our cities and the way they work and operate just to allow for us to use this little box for 5% of the time. And at best, that car only actually efficiently uses the gasoline you put into it. About 25% or about 25% of that fuel is actually efficiently used. I can go on and on about that. But anyway, this is just to illustrate, we surely can come up with a much better way of, I think, doing things in our society. But the car, I think, really is, one example of kind of the engine of capitalist growth, and it cannot be sacrificed. There was a report that was put out by Scientific American magazine that highlighted what you would need to power the planet. What would you need to build? The world uses about 15 terawatts of power every second. But the sun, to give a comparison, gives out about 101,000 terawatts of power. So we would need only a little fraction of 1% of solar energy that the Earth absorbs to actually power the world. Although you'd want to mix some of this different energy sources to get it to work practically, but it kind of gives you a sense of what can be done. So Scientific American said that we would need what would we need to do to change over from fossil fuels would be to build 3.8 million wind turbines and about 90,000 solar arrays over a 20-year period, and then you'd be able to power all over the world. Well, you can say that 3.8 million wind turbines and 90,000 solar arrays is a lot to build. That's actually going to cost billions and billions of dollars. It would require massive worldwide coordination, massive retooling of industry. But just to put that into context, we build 70 million cars every single year. I don't think it takes any kind of climate scientist to say, why is it that we are going to continue to base our entire economic production on building these little boxes that drive around and screw up the planet? We can easily employ the exact same people with the exact same factories, some different training, a little bit of retooling, and build those 3.8 million wind turbines, those 90,000 solar arrays that we'll need to actually produce our power in an environmentally sustainable way. The answers are all right before us, and what is preventing us from getting there is a social system we live under which benefits immensely from the exploitation of the many by the few and the exploitation of the natural world upon which we depend, but upon which we think, which they think we are entirely independent of and we can exist without. I think we need to operate in two different levels to address this. First, we need to fight for some real reforms, which means some action from the government because it's obvious that it's not going to come from the private sector. The reason we need to fight for some real reforms is because nothing is coming from anywhere else. We are given three options for solutions to climate change and ecological disaster. This is what kind of the mainstream, I think, kind of political and media class kind of puts forward as how we should view and address these issues. First, there will have to be some kind of technological answer to climate change. We'll bury CO2 underground, so carbon sequestration, Thank you. We'll have clean coal, which is my favorite. We can go on about that. I have a whole meeting we can talk about clean coal. It's just a myth. The pipe dream is bullshit. We can put, this is one of my favorites, mirrors, giant, like massive mile-wide mirrors into space, which is actually really a proposal that's being talked about seriously, to deflect sunlight so a little bit less hits the planet. We can see the oceans with iron, and all of this in order to carry on with producing CO2. So we don't change our economic system, we don't change anything we do about destroying the planet. It's just like do these massive bioengineering projects which we don't really know what the kind of the side effects might be. Secondly, we're told that the market, the cause of the problem itself, will get us out of it. Cap and trade. Cap and trade will work. This is the cap and trade kind of scheme. I can't go into a lot of it. People should bring it up in discussion. But basically, let's take carbon credits and let's bet it on the stock market. So, who is the biggest proponents of cap and trade legislation? Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs. All the different financial services things. Companies that were behind the crash in 2008, basically to see them really, I think, a juicy market in that. And then the third other explanation is that we're the problem. Our individual lifestyles need to change. In the developed world, we're the problem because we consume too much, we drive too much, we use disposable coffee cups, we don't use incandescent light bulbs, et cetera, et cetera. Or if you don't live in the developed world, if you live in the third world as it's known, you're having too many kids, right? That's the other argument that's put forward. Not to even mention the whole, I think, actually kind of racist, kind of seeded racism that's involved with it, because it's like, we're not having too many people, but people in India, people in China are having too many people. All of these things, apart from, I think, being racist, let the system that caused the problem off the hook. So we have to put limits on the system's operation, which means genuine reforms that re-regulate corporations and say they are the ones who have to pay for the mess they created. For example, Shell and Exxon last year made $54 billion in profit from destroying the planet. At the same time, they also claimed $800 million in tax relief from the US government. So I think we need to fight for some real reforms, which means we need to build a mass movement. And a mass movement which has to build into itself not only the question of ecological justice, but also of social justice. Because we're not going to get one without the other, I think. The two are completely linked. So you have to form the kind of movement that has the radicalism of the 1960s social movements, which really I think was the birth of the environmental movement, with the organization and social power of the union movement of the 1930s. I think right now this is actually more possible now than ever, actually, any other time in the last 30, 40 years. Some examples of things like this. Well, first and foremost, in this, I think people in this room were very much involved. The Occupy movement, I think, really kind of opened up the discussion of activism in this country. I think you have things like the Arab Spring, obviously, I think that had an impact on Occupy in this country and really showed the actual power that ordinary people have in mobilizing. I think you have the heroic example of Chicago teachers going on strike against one of the nastiest mayors in the country who wants to shut down a bunch of education reform they don't want to put forward. And in this very room, we have some folks who are involved in the courageous fight, I think, going on with the Garfield teachers who are refusing to do the math tests. And so I think what that, how are these all connected is that there's an underlying problem with our system that we know it doesn't work for us as ordinary people. And that's always been the case, but right now people are really starting to see that, and more importantly, they're going to take action around that. And so building a kind of ecological movement that actually takes into account social justice and has a much more, I think, developed worldview of how we can actually change things is more possible today than it has been at any other time. But I also think we need a much bigger vision for what an equitable and sustainable world would really look like. What would we want if we could redesign Seattle or any other city to build it for humans and not for cars? What would a city look like if we took just cars out of the equation and started building more green space, connecting the city to the countryside, knowing where your food came from, which most of us, what kind of food we actually eat, we barely call food anymore. What would it mean to have sustainable agriculture that could absolutely feed the whole world? These all require a complete reimagining of our future. One of the things that capitalism does is to narrow our mind to think within the confines of the current system. The only way out is not only to start to fight back, but also to have a much bigger vision for change. Because we can all come up with utopian scenarios about what kind of world we want to live in, but it's about taking the fetters off of our minds and having a much bigger and more systemic look at the vision for the future.